Whereas I think with Visa and Mastercard, they're assigning a higher price to their value because it's a longer period of value and it's going to be more valuable longer. Whereas Wise and Remitly they've both been around for 5-10 years, but they're also still early in the journey in what they're doing. And there's no guarantee that Visa at some point may outdo both of them. And that could be a very big thing for them and MasterCard. And what Wise and Remitly are doing could be competed away and very easily. And so I think that the market is actually probably thinking that that's what's going on, because if you look at the financials, if you look at the revenue growth for Wise, for example, it's ridiculous, 60-70%, crazy numbers. But the market is not valuing it very much. It's not valuing it very highly. It's a lower rated company, if you will. And I think a lot of it is because there's a lot of uncertainty that can they really continue to compete in the space when Visa and MasterCard, the juggernauts, are there and are capable of doing what they're doing as easily if they choose to do it.
A lot of times that's kind of what it comes down to, right? When you have these differences in valuation, people are going to say different things, but a lot of it can come down to, if you're talking to, let's be clear, if you're talking to long-term investors who are looking to buy and hold something and compound it and just sit there and do nothing, the differences in valuation are maybe more differences on how long do people expect a competitive advantage to last for a certain company.
I mean, we were talking earlier on our valuation hackathon about O'Reilly. And I think if you think about how the market is treating that company, or a way a lot of investors think about that company, is that the EV revolution is going to be the death knell for a company like O'Reilly or AutoZone. And I think because of that, I think investors look at their potential competitive advantage period as a lot shorter than they would a company like Tesla, for example. Tesla is, I think we would all agree is a unique case because, of who drives the bus at that company. And so he engenders a lot of, well, good and bad, attention. And there is definitely some enthusiasm baked into the value of that company. But it's unquestionably that they've done a fantastic job doing what they do. But are they really going to come eat the lunch, at some point of an AutoZone? I don't know. I mean, we could probably argue about that from now until the end of time. But I think the market, when they look at AutoZone and O'Reilly, I think they look at them as like, not that they're bad companies, but they're like dead men walking because disruption's coming for them. It's just a matter of when.
Do you think there are ways that the cap idea is taken too far, where people kind of run with it? And have you seen examples of that where people kind of run with the cap idea?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
What does that look like?
I think the way you can look at it is there's a couple ways you can look at it. So number one, when you're normally doing a valuation of a company, you want to estimate the terminal growth rate at roughly the GDP or somewhere in that range. Anything above the growth rate of the GDP, if you do it to infinity, then that's not logical. It's not reasonable. It can't happen because of just the nature of compounding. And I remember a story that Professor Demoterin talked about where he had students turn in valuations, and one student turned in a valuation with Tesla, and their terminal rate, which is normally 2 to 5%, give or take, he had put it 8%. And so the value of the company, he was projecting basically that in a 20-year period, that Tesla would be larger than the GDP of the United States. And if you went another 10 years, it would be larger than the GDP of the world. And so everything that everybody did would have to be bought from Tesla and nothing else. And obviously that's not That's not reasonable. And no matter how much you drink the Kool-Aid, that's not reasonable for any company, and even Costco. So I guess the point is that when you think about those things, you have to think about it has to be you have to be logical and try to be reasonable about that. And so when you're thinking about the competitive advantage period, the enthusiasm you have about a business has to be built into some sort of realities of history of business, how long companies have been in business, how long they can stay on top. You would be surprised how short that really can be. I don't have the numbers in front of me, and I'm not recalling them, and maybe Andrew can fill in if he remembers, but the amount of time a company spends in the S&P 500 as a member is not very long. I think it's less than 10 years. And if you look back on the last 20 or 30 years of like the top 10 companies, I know Buffett showed this at a shareholder meeting recently. If you look at the last 20 or 30 years, the amount of companies that have stayed in that top 10 of the S&P is 2, Apple and Microsoft. The rest of them have all fluctuated in and out. There's been the Ciscos, and then there's been the Exxons and the companies like that, and then now we have Apple and Microsoft and Nvidia. But those a lot of these companies are new to the S&P 500, new to the top. Meta is new, Nvidia is new, Tesla is new, Berkshire Hathaway is new. They've been around for 60 years, but this is a new thing for them. And so my point with all that is that when you're trying to value a company and you're looking at this idea of extending your valuation because you think their competitive advantage is going to be a lot longer than a 10-year period, it may very well be, but it can't be 40 years. Just because that's just not, it's not logical, it's not sustainable. And if it is, it's going to be one unicorn company, one, not 10 of them, one unicorn company that could possibly do that. And there's always outliers when you're thinking about valuing companies, and you have to try to be as reasonable as you possibly can. And the thing that I like about the competitive advantage period is it helps explain maybe why a company like a Costco or a MasterCard seems like it's always expensive. And it's because the value that the company is creating is a longer period than its normal brethren in the 10-year range. And so that makes sense logically. But the hard part about it is that there is no rule or hard fast number that you can apply to it. It takes some intuition, and it also takes some knowledge of the business and the history of the company and the industry they work in to kind of extend those numbers to give you a range of what you think the value could be. And I mean, it's not easy, and it's not hard, and you can't apply it to every single company, because the simple fact of the matter is that companies rise, companies fall, and they go out of business. And it happens to all of them. If you looked at 30 years ago and you asked our grandparents or our parents, do you think GE would be not the dominant business that it is today? Nobody would have said yes. I mean, and look at it now; it's a shell of itself. And it used to be one of the most dominant businesses in the United States, and now it's a shell. And we look at Microsoft and Apple and think that's never going to happen to them, but it could. It probably will at some point. We don't want it to, but that's just the reality of investing, is nothing stays the same forever.
Vitaly Katsenelson did a email that he did recently. It was an article he wrote. I think he said it was one of the first ones he ever wrote. It was like 1994 or something. And he was talking about the danger of I don't know if he called it or somebody else called it, like religion stocks.
Yeah, religion stocks. Yeah.
Oh, you read this?
Yeah.
It was fascinating. He brought up Coca-Cola, and really with the presence of any of these religion stocks, they become religion stocks because they make people a bunch of money. And then so because the stock's been so good for so long, it gets this cult type following. Use Coca-Cola as an example. Or no, I guess he wrote this in 2004. So it was 20 years ago, not 30. My bad. But yeah, looking at Coca-Cola, and at the time in 1999, the PE got to something like a 45. And the 10-year growth rate of earnings at the time was 14.2%. So you would look at that and you would say, why wouldn't they continue? They've had like amazing CEO, earnings growth at 14% a year for 10 years. Like, what's not to love? And you fast forward just a few 5 years later. And then even looking back in hindsight today, it hasn't been, I mean, yeah, the relative strength between Coca-Cola and Pepsi and say Dr. Pepper, it's still there. But I guess the thing that frame didn't think of is maybe people becoming more health conscious or something. So a disruption, if you will, that came out of left field, that maybe Coke's moat didn't get weaker against its competitors, but something else came. Customers' preferences changed. And it just goes to show that that idea of a cap and the limitedness of it is a very uncomfortable thing to have to deal with as an investor.
It is.
But if we were to respect history, then we'll know that it's something to watch out for.